Yashodanandana Brajanandana Yashodanandana Prabhupada ki jai. So reading from...
They're not there.
They're not there. Really? It's not inside?
He'll run and get them. They're
Okay.
not there. What's this?
Oh wait, it's you?
Here.
I could do that.
If you had your glasses on, you would see them.
I could do that on the last and I forgot. So, this chapter is entitled Breaking Ground. Prabhupada is in New York City. This is his first, thank you, his first temple. It's a storefront on the Lower East Side of the Bowery, New York, which is the lowest place in New York. It's surprising they call it the Lower East Side, but it was lower for many other reasons. So we read last week how Prabhupada gave a nice, his first kirtan. And the people who came were swept away by the kirtan. Prabhupada chanted enthusiastically and everyone was dancing and chanting. And then he spoke for a little bit, just a little bit. There were a few, actually there was one rowdy person who wanted to hear himself talk. And he didn't really have a question. His mind was, we would say, his mind was blown from drugs. And so he couldn't even, but he wanted to speak. And Prabhupada just tolerated him and told him to wait till the end and if you have a question. But he was impatient. And Prabhupada told one of the regular boys who were coming to speak with him. So, then Prabhupada left and retired to his apartment while his guests disappeared through the front door back into the city. Don and Raphael, they would turn out the lights in the storefront and lock the front door. once everyone had left. And they would go to sleep on the floor with their blankets. So this is the first temple. Don and Raphael, they had needed a place to stay. And when they heard about the Swami's place, they came. Prabhupada had a policy that any boy who expressed even a little interest in becoming his student could stay in his storefront and make it his home. There was no furniture whatsoever, no chairs, nothing. Of course, Prabhupada would ask them to contribute towards the rent and the meals that would be served. But if, like Don and Raphael, they had no money, he would still let them stay, provided they helped in other ways. So Don and Raphael were the first two boys to take advantage of Prabhupada's offer. They were attracted to the Swamiji and the chanting, but they weren't really serious about his philosophy or the disciplines of devotional life. They had no jobs and no money. Their hair was long and unkept, and they lived and slept in the same clothes day after day. This was quite common. Prabhupada stipulated that at least while they were on the premises, they could not break the rules, which were no intoxication, no illicit sex, no meat eating, and no gambling. He knew that these two boarders weren't serious students, but he allowed them to stay in hopes that maybe gradually they would become serious. Often, some wayfaring stranger would stop by looking for a place to crash, to stay the night. And Don and Raphael, they would welcome, so they were like the hosts now. Once an old, white-bearded Indian man who had turned to becoming a Christian, and he was on a walking mission, proclaiming to everyone that the end of the world was near. His feet was covered with bandages, and once he slept for a few nights on a wooden bench in the storefront. Some nights as many as 10 wandering drifters would spend the night. And Don and Raphael would admit them, explaining to them, Swamiji didn't object to them spending the night as long as they got up early. Even way back then, Prabhupada wanted people to get up early in the morning. Prabhupada used to say, to get up early in the morning is healthy life. As a boy, I heard, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. It's true. So, but Prabhupada would have, even if once somebody came for one night, they had to get up early in the morning. Even the drifters, whose only interest was a free meal, they could stay. And after the morning class and breakfast, they would usually drift off again into Maya. Don and Raphael were the Swami's steady boarders. Although during the day, they also went out, returning only for meals and to sleep, and they stayed for the evening chanting. Occasionally, they would bathe. And then they would use the Swami's bathroom, which was in his apartment. His apartment was, I believe, behind the storefront upstairs. There was like an apartment complex. Sometimes they would hang out in the storefront during the day, and if someone stopped by asking about the Swami's classes, they would tell the person all that they knew, which wasn't much. They knew what time classes and chanting and prasadam was. They also admitted to others that they weren't really into the Swami's philosophy, and they didn't claim to be his followers. If someone persisted in inquiring about the teachings of the Swami, Don and Raphael would suggest, why don't you go up and talk to him? Because they knew nothing. The Swami lives in the apartment building out in the back. Why don't you go up and see him? So Prabhupada, during the day, usually stayed in his apartment. Occasionally he might look out his window and see through the back windows of the storefront that the lights in the closet-sized bathroom had needlessly been left on. Prabhupada would come downstairs to ask one of the boys to turn off the light and not waste electricity. He might find a few new boys lying on the floor, talking or reading. And Prabhupada would stand gravely, asking them not to leave the lights on, stressing the seriousness of wasting Krishna's energy and money. He would stand dressed in khadi, which is a coarse, hand-loomed cotton woven cloth, woven from hand-spun threads. This cloth, which appeared to Americans as somewhat exotic, and even the saffron color that Prabhupada wore, his dhoti and chadar, to the Americans this was exotic. It's not every day you see someone dressed like that. Prabhupada's clothing was different from anything Western. And after Prabhupada had turned off the lights, the boys seemed to have nothing to say and nothing more appropriate to do than to just look at the Swami for a long, awkward moment, trying to figure him out. And the Swami would leave without saying anything more. Money was scarce. From his evening meetings, he would usually collect about $5 or $6 in change mostly. And Don, one of the two boys, talked of going up to New England to pick apples and bring back some money for the Swami. Raphael said something about he had some money coming to him. But Prabhupada was depending on Krishna. If they brought it, he would accept. Sometimes he would walk back and forth in the courtyard between the buildings in the back, seeming mysterious to his neighbors. He would walk back and forth, chanting on his beads, with his hand deep in his bead bag. But mostly he kept to his room, working. Working meant translating. He was translating books from Sanskrit language into English. Now those books are available around the world. As he had said during one lecture, when he was living on the Bari, he would say, "I am here, always working at something, reading or writing, 24 hours in the day." His mission of translating the Srimad Bhagavatam, of presenting the complete work in 60 volumes of 400 pages each, that alone would occupy all his days and nights. He worked at it whenever possible, sitting at his portable typewriter, translating the Sanskrit into English and giving commentary. He especially worked in the very early hours of the morning so that he would not be interrupted. He would comb through the Sanskrit and Bengali commentaries of the previous great acharyas. Following their explanation, he would select certain passages from them, and then adding his own knowledge and realization. And then laboriously weaving it all together and typing it out, and typing out his Bhaktivedanta purports. So when you get Prabhupada's books, these Bhaktivedanta purports, it's a combination of previous spiritual masters who had given commentaries, who had written commentaries. And Prabhupada was sharing some of their commentaries, mixed in with his commentary and the translation. In this way, you're really getting a lot. He would always say, "I'm only following in the footsteps of the previous teachers." And so you're getting really a substantial presentation. He had no means or immediate plans for financing the publishing of his further volumes. But he continued in the faith, somehow they would be published. You see, when Prabhupada came from India, he brought with him the first 3 volumes of the Srimad Bhagavatam that he had printed in India. It was the first canto, and as he was writing, when he wrote them, and he wanted to come to bring something. He said, when someone asked him, why didn't you come earlier? He said, I had to have something to give you. When he had finished the first canto, first 3 volumes, he felt, now I'm ready. And he brought 2 trunks big trunks as big as this seat, filled with copies of his books. But he wasn't content to just stop there. He wanted to give the whole Srimad Bhagavatam, as you say here. He projected it would take 60 volumes, because the Srimad Bhagavatam is said to be the cream of all the Vedic literatures. It consists of 18,000 verses, Sanskrit verses. So it's not a small task to take up. But he was determined. And and as it says, he had no idea how he's going to publish it. You know, his gatherings, which happened 3 times a week, he'd collect $5 or $6. It's not enough to do anything, you know. But he was inspired and empowered to write, and he knew that somehow or other they will be distributed. And today his books are still being distributed around the world. It's like we heard this morning, just in one day, yesterday, how many books were distributed here in France. And this is happening all around the world. Followers of Prabhupada are going out daily to distribute this transcendental knowledge. We say transcendental because transcendental means beyond space and time. You're getting knowledge beyond space and time. He had a broad mission, even broader than his translating Srimad Bhagavatam. And so he gave much of his time and energy to meeting visitors who stopped by. Had his only aim been to write, there would have been no need to have taken the risk and trouble of coming to America. He could have written in India, but he was coming to preach. Now many people were coming, and an important part of his mission was to talk to them and convince them of Krishna consciousness. His visitors were usually young men who had recently come to live on the Lower East Side. As I said, the Lower East Side was lower, and many people who came there because rent was cheap, and at the time many people would rent, combine and live in one apartment just because they wanted to be in New York City, and this was the only place they could exist in New York City, was the Bowery, because everything was cheap there. He had no secretary, nobody to do anything for him, no one to screen his visitors, nor did he have any scheduled visiting hours. Whenever anyone happened by, at any time from early in the morning to 10 at night, Prabhupada would stop his typing or translating and speak with them. It was an open neighborhood, and many visitors were just walking right off the street. Some of them were serious, but most of them were not. They were just curious. Some of them even came intoxicated. I mean, this is the 60s. And there was a slogan in the 60s, said, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Turn on, which means to get stoned, tune in and drop out. And this was many young people, most of the, this is the era of the hippies. So, oftentimes, his guests would come not to inquire submissively, but to challenge him. One time, a young hippie who was on an LSD trip, and when they took some LSD, they called it a trip, because you would hallucinate. So once a young hippie on an LSD trip found his way upstairs and sat down opposite the Swami. He said to the Swami, "Right now I am higher than you." He says, "I am higher than you." He's on a trip, And then he said, "I am God." Oh. Prabhupada just bowed his head slightly and folded his hands like this. So you are God? Okay. He said to the young man, "Please accept my obeisances." You say you are God. And then Prabhupada asked this God to please leave now. Very politely, Please leave now. There were others who admitted frankly that they were crazy or haunted by ghosts, but they sought relief from their mental suffering. There was one fellow, Lon Solomon, he said, "I was looking for spiritual centers, places where one could go, not like stores where they ask you to leave, but where you could actually talk to people and try to understand the ultimate truth. So I would come to the Swamis knowing that this was definitely a spiritual center. There was definitely something there. Of course, I was on drugs and disturbed with the notion that I might be God." He was thinking like that also. Or if not, I must be some very important personality way out of proportion to my actual situation. He was honest. He said, "I was actually in trouble. I was mentally deranged because of so much suffering, and I would kind of blow in to see him whenever I felt the whim to do so. I didn't make a point of going to his meetings, but a lot of times I would just come over. One time I came and I spent the night there, and I was always welcomed at any time to sleep on the floor in the storefront. I wanted to show the Swami